All right, thanks everybody. So you can rest easy. This is not a lecture about North Africa, as you can see from my first slide. I'll get into this, but I think the first thing I need to do is I need to explain the title a little bit. Right? It certainly is intentionally provocative. The background of this is that the title itself, when I talk about a half pound, this is actually the weight of most smartphones. This is according to the Apple Corporation, right? That even the biggest one weighs about half a pound. So that's where that comes from. But on the whole notion of why I chose to use hell, right? I want to be clear to everybody, this is not a lecture about metaphysics. It has nothing to do with eternal destinies or anything like that. What it really has to do with is our capacity to design our own hells. That is, to set up our lives in such a way that it can feel, at least temporarily, right, or a short period or a long period or whatever, it can feel like we're actually living in hell because of the difficult situations we put ourselves in. Okay? The question, or the question mark I should say, is also important, right? Because I want to be clear about where I'm going tonight. That is to say, this is not a situation where I'm preaching or, certainly in no way am I judging, anything like that. This has everything to do with the fact that this is really designed to be an inquiry. Okay, so I'm going to put some data on the table. It's going to have to do with a lot of things I've been reading, because this is a concern of mine, which I'll say more about in a minute. It's a long-standing concern of mine, the role of smartphones and social media in our culture. But in any case, that's sort of like why the title is this way and what's really behind it. So let me do this, really, kind of as an opening exercise. All right? So if we're going to talk about sort of us and we and our culture and that sort of thing, let me ask you, if you have a smartphone with you tonight, will you hold it up? Hold it up high. I just want to see who, right? And I suspected, hey, come on in. I suspected, right, that it would be 100%. And that's exactly true, right? Everybody in this room owns a cell phone. All right? So that's important. Keep that percentage in mind. And I'm guessing, right, that it's probably very close to 100% campus-wide. It might go down to 98 or 99, but if you walk around, right, it's not hard to see that this is basically ubiquitous on our campus, right? Now, one more thing. If you'll take just a minute, I'd like to invite you to turn it off for the duration of the talk. Invite you, right? You don't have to. See where you are on that. All right? Think about this, though, too. If you're honest, and whether you did it or not, right? Even if you thought about it, right? And then decided not to because the thought of sitting here for the next 45 minutes without your phone being on, causes some level of anxiety. Think about that. Why did that happen? Why did that generate anxiety? Why was that a hard question? And I imagine most other things I ask you to do, you'd be like, okay, sure, right? But the whole notion of just even turning off your cell phone for many people, even for a short period of time, can cause stress. All right. One other thing I need to do is explain if this works. There we go. Explain a little bit more about who I am and why I'm here, right? So this is going to go a little deeper with Mark's introduction. I'm approaching this topic about spirituality of smartphones and technology as a Christian. Need to put that on the table. As Mark already made clear, I'm a historical theologian, right? Which should go a long way to indicating that this is not my field. I'm not an expert in personal technology. I'm not an expert. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist, etc. Right? But at the same time, I also want to be clear that even with the title of a talk like this, I'm not anti-technology, either personal or otherwise. I think technology is great, right? Really, the perspective I'm coming at this issue from is really to ask questions about our adoption of personal technology, about why we do what we do, and how much thought we put into it. And then, once we've made a decision, how often and how thoroughly we're willing to question that decision. Okay? If that makes sense. A couple more things about me. I do own a smartphone, right? Which is true, and hopefully illustrates that I'm not completely anti-technology, right? Although it is true that sometimes I wonder why. And I am, I've used it enough, and I've familiar enough with what it can bring and what it can bring to my life that I've actually had a few YouTube hangovers. And what I mean by that is, you all have this experience. You go on YouTube for just a minute, thinking you're going to look at this one thing, and the next thing you know, you look up. It's 2 hours later. And you're like, what happened? How did that happen, right? And it's 2 hours of your life you're not going to get back, right? So I call that a YouTube hangover. I've had a few of those, but I've certainly never been proud of it, either later in the day or the next day, okay? At the same time, I want to be clear about that. I think I get it, right? So I also am coming at this, hopefully, from the standpoint of not somebody who's just trying to critique, what he sees around him. And I'm not just trying to be a curmudgeon, right? I understand, I think, right, why everybody has a smartphone. Why everybody makes such prolific use of social media, right? I get it. I think I see some of the advantages. At the same time, I do not use social media. You're like, why? Well, that's a long story. We don't have time for that. But suffice it to say that this is actually a decision I personally made over 20 years ago, right? When social media just began to be a thing in the earlier middle 2000s. I just took a look at it, and I saw what some of my friends were doing, and I thought, I don't really want to spend my time that way. It looked at it to me like there was a potential for that to be a big waste of time. I don't know if I'm right or not. I don't know, maybe I really am missing out. I don't know. But here it is 20 years later. I've still never been on social media. And I'm reasonably happy. I think I'm as happy as probably the next person. But anyway, just want to let you know kind of where I was coming from and who I am. All right, so this is why I'm here. I've already mentioned the fact that, I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert in this field or any related fields. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. But I am a teacher. And I am a father, right? And what I see around me does cause concern. My daughter is 9 years old. She does not have a smartphone. But, her mother and I know we're not that blind. We know it's coming, right? We know the questions are coming. It's going to be probably just a matter of when one of her friends gets one, she's going to come home that day and she's going to want one, right? That's probably what's going to happen. So we're wrestling with this, and I'm trying to gather some data. I'm trying to be informed as I make a decision that I know is going to have to come. So again, I'm neither a psychologist or a sociologist, but what I hope to do tonight is to show that even secondhand, right? And that's everything I'm going to present to you tonight is secondhand. None of this is based on my own research. I don't even know how to do the research that a lot of these conclusions are based on. But even secondhand, I want to show that I think the data for thinking this through and then occasionally or periodically rethinking it is clear and compelling. Okay? All right. One more step, and then we'll get into some of the details. So like any good paper, right, or any good presentation, I want to have a thesis. My thesis tonight is this. As a culture, our incautious and en masse adoption of smartphones and social media have left us in deep trouble. Okay? The many negative impacts of these choices, both known and unknown, and that's the key. It's one of the things I really want to highlight tonight. The data is just now beginning to come in on what these choices are doing to us. Okay? But both known and unknown are severely hindering our ability to pursue many of life's best aspects, including the spiritual life. So that's my perspective. That's what I'm going to try to argue. And again, I'm just going to present some details. Right? I'm going to try to. My goal is to get you guys to think this through, to ask some questions. Okay? All right. So, last part of the introduction. A few things for your consideration. Actually, these are questions. Okay? I do not want you guys to answer these right now. I just want you to think about it. Okay? Number one, is our culture, collectively speaking, addicted to smartphones and social media? Number two, are you, as an individual and a component part of this broader culture, addicted to smartphones, to your smartphone and to social media? And maybe most importantly, how would you know? How would you measure this? Right? And not only I think the third question is the most important, I think it's probably the most debated, at least according to the research and reading that I've done, right? Now, addiction is, of course, a loaded word. I admit that up front, right? It's heavy, it's extreme. And I'm the first one to admit that, is even if all this is true, is this the worst or the deepest kind of addiction? No. Right? I mean, it's probably not. It's certainly not the same thing as being addicted to opioids or some other drug. But it might well be the same as some sort of food addiction or some deeply ingrained habit, in that it feels like an addiction, at least from time to time. Okay? And a good question is that what's the practical difference between actually being addicted and feeling addicted? Right? I know if you truly are addicted to something, it is worse. So I freely admit that. But practically speaking, what's the difference? If you feel like you're addicted, if you feel bound, if you feel entrapped by the choices you made in terms of how you use your smartphone and how you use social media. On top of that, and this is the first spiritual consideration of my talk, do you really want to be bound by anything? Right? Even if it just feels like addiction, is this what you want? Is it possible to truly maximize your ability to flourish if you are addicted? Especially when you're addicted to something that another entity actually controls your access to. Right? Really quick, I don't want to take too much time on this, but think about the phone that you have and your access to it, and then, of course, the social media. How many other people are involved in serving that access to you? How many other people, if you are dependent on it, you're dependent on of their good graces and, not only the technology remaining functional and all that and power, etc., but I just mean how many other people that you're basically giving yourself over to deliver all of these things to you, collectively known as big tech, okay? We'll talk about that more in a minute. Okay, for your consideration. All right. So here's where I want to begin the process of going a little deeper into this concept of designing our own hell. Okay? This may be an imperfect analogy or imperfect link, but I'd like you to consider the United States history with cigarettes, tobacco cigarettes, and what we already know about this history. Here's a few of the details for your consideration. The first mass market campaign with tobacco cigarettes goes all the way back to 1913. R.J. Reynolds Corporation. In fact, this campaign was so successful that within about 40 years, 1954, the United States culture achieved the high watermark of cigarette tobacco use, or tobacco cigarette use in this culture. That high watermark was 45%. That is to say, throughout the United States population, it came to a level where 45% of the United States population was regularly smoking tobacco cigarettes. Okay? All the way back in 1954. What's striking and what I want you to see here is that formally, it was another 10 years and more than 50 years after the first mass market campaign before the U.S. government got involved. All right? 1964 is the first formal statement by the U.S. Attorney General that questioned smoking. That basically said smoking's not good. It began to highlight the health effects, the negative health effects. Okay? That's not to say that there was no data prior to this. It certainly was. The data by this point was at least 10 years old. But the government finally got involved 10 years after the fact and 50 years after the first mass market campaign. Okay? One more data point for your consideration. 2015 marked the first year, and this is still where we are in terms of the broader culture, the first year that the United States population's percentage of tobacco cigarette use fell below 20%. Okay? 2023, we're still below 20%. It's getting a little bit down closer to 15%. But it's still a lot of people. Okay? I also want to point out the fact that this is more than a century after the problem was introduced, or the issue was introduced to the United States culture. In the meantime, no one really knows how many millions of people this cost them their lives or it cut their life short. What we do know is even today, this is data from 2021, tobacco cigarette use in this country still costs an estimated 500,000 people. It kills 500,000 people per year. right? And if you can assume a steady rate of this, then you're easily into the tens of millions of people who have suffered, whose life has been cut short, chronic sickness, you name it. All the things that we know today are true about heavy tobacco cigarette use follow from that. Okay? All right. So I want you to keep this in mind as well. Also want to point out the fact that, even after you want to figure another half century of government involvement from 1964, and all the campaign and all the money and all the effort that was spent in educating people about tobacco cigarettes and the harm, all they were able to do was cut the tobacco rate from 45% to 20%. It's not like it eliminated it. It got more expensive. And it certainly, went down the socioeconomic chain as far as who's doing the most of the smoking, but it didn't eliminate it. I want you to keep that in mind as well. Okay? And I think this is a pretty good example of our society's past success at designing our own hell. All right. So this is switching back to smartphones and social media. I'm going to talk about kind of what I see as a work in progress, about how we're currently designing our own hell with smartphones and social media. Okay? So we're switching over from big tobacco to big tech. Okay? And these are some facts about our collective present. 2003, I've already made reference to this. 2003 were the first social media companies that were launched. Right? If you're in this room and you're 20 years old, you've never lived in a world without social media, right? It's just been there from the jump. Okay? 2003. 2007 is the first smartphone introduced by Apple. 2009, the first like button, right? And this is important because this is what introduced the phenomenon of feedback, right? And I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of people in the world who suffer with what is clinically known as affirmation addiction, right? Where they get dependent upon the responses of things that they post and they write about, right? I didn't make that term up. It's out there. It's in the literature. It's a thing, okay? So 2009, the like button. 2012 was a major turning point. That's when 50% of Americans, right? It was known that 50% of Americans had a smartphone, right? In 2012, we finally surpassed the high water mark of tobacco use, right? Way back in 1954. If we run a parallel here between tobacco use and smartphone ownership, right? 50% in 2012. 2013, another massive watershed, right? The so-called share button, right? This, among more than anything else, is what led to the whole viral phenomenon, right? With the good and the bad that's brought with it, right? When things go viral, right? You guys, I don't even need to tell you about that. You guys know all about that. 2017, 75% of American teenagers have a smartphone. That's just 6 years ago. And again, I don't want to beat this horse too much, but just think back about when I asked everybody to raise your smartphone if you have one, right? It's 100% in this room, right? I don't know if you guys are representative of American culture or not, but it's gone from 75 to 100 at least for people who are related to Villanova. 2022, as of last year, we've made another turning point, going from 50 to 85% of the American population on smartphones. Keep that in mind. That's that's almost twice the number of people who smoke cigarettes at the high water mark of tobacco use. Okay? Again, just run on parallel tracks here. All right. There you go. So, an obvious objection is, but wait, those are just numbers. How can you assume that because these numbers are what they are, we're actually in the process of building another hell? Like, how do you know that this stuff is actually adding up to being something negative? Fair question, right? Short answer is, I can't. That's what I'm here for. I'm trying to make an argument, right? At least putting things on there for your consideration. I don't have proof. I can't predict the future. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's at least worth considering, okay? Number one, the devil is in the details, right? The numbers are helpful. They're an interesting introduction to the problem, but you have to look closely. And you have to ask a lot of hard questions before you can really know where this thing is going, right? In fact, like cigarettes, smartphones are just things, right? The presence of cigarettes in our culture didn't do any harm. It's what people did with them, right? That where the problems began to start. I think that's another parallel, right? So the questions become, how do we really use them? Meaning our smartphones. Not what do we say, not how do we present our smartphone ownership, but what do we really do? What's reality, right? And what impacts are they really having? Not necessarily even what we feel, but what are they actually having? These are important questions, right? So how do we really use them? And this is just one more little parallel that Dr. Graham can back me up on this, because you have to be of a certain age to remember when a lot of people smoked, right? But I noticed a phenomenon, right? When I was younger, around people that smoked, I actually asked a couple of them the question, so how many cigarettes do you smoke a day? I found out, right, kind of by anecdotal evidence, usually asking their partner or their husband or wife, right, found out usually people's propensity was to lowball it. Like if somebody smoked 2 packs a day, they'd tell you they smoked a pack. Smoke 3 packs a day, they tell you they smoke 2, right? There's this sort of social phenomenon of where if you think people are judging you, you're going to actually try to come in under their expectations because you don't want that, or you think there's some social stigma attached to it, whatever, right? It's an interesting phenomenon of kind of lowballing. Okay, so those are the questions, and I want to remind you again that even on these parallel tracks between cigarettes and social media and smartphone use, you've got to keep these numbers in mind. 45% high water mark versus 85% high water mark. Which I don't think, by the way, we even achieved the high water mark yet. I think as a culture, it looks like we're going to get way over 90% before all is said and done in terms of smartphone usage, right? But we'll see. But we already know it's at 85%. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do for the next 2 big chunks of this talk is I'm going to give you some data about 6 significant negative impacts of smartphones and social media, okay, on us both individually and collectively. We're going to go through 6, 1, 2, 3 through 6, and then I'm going to also talk about at least here and there some of the obvious spiritual impacts this is having, right? I want to be clear up front, right, that the spiritual impact of these phenomena is not automatic. Nor is each of these likely to have an equal impact, right? So that's sort of another question beyond what I'm presenting in terms of the data. It's going to take some work to kind of fill in the gap between the data and the actual spiritual impact. But I will argue that what's going on is already having an impact on your spiritual life. Right? That's sort of the meta point. So we're going to talk about 6 negative impacts, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about some steps that you might want to consider if this data kind of resonates with you. Okay? So this is issue number 1 of the 6 I'm going to present to you. Right? This is sort of in pursuing this idea. Perhaps we have a work in progress in terms of designing our own hell, both individually and collectively. Issue number 1. Overuse of smartphones and social media may harm your physical health. Okay? I'm not going to go over all of these that I'm listed here. Don't have quite that much time. You can see these for yourself, right? But they range from everything from accidents, unintended accidents, to distracted walking. If you don't think this is an issue, try driving your car on campus. You really have to pay attention to all the pedestrians. I realize it's a walking campus, so I'm not complaining. I'm just saying the number of students that I see got their head down, earbuds in, they're looking on their phone, they're walking across campus, right? They don't see and they can't hear. Just throwing that out there for your consideration, right? The number of people who die taking the perfect photo or trying to generate the perfect video for social media. Distracted driving. This is shocking to me. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, so the U.S. government, said that in 2020, this accounted for 3,142 U.S. deaths that they knew of. That's more than 9/11 every year. People just look on their phone while they're driving. Okay? Sleep deprivation. Right? this is the one I want to spend just a little bit of time on, right? Of course, this is not a new problem, right, for students. Students have been sleep deprived probably since, universities in the Middle Ages, right? I don't think this is a new problem. But what I do want to highlight is that according to the data, back in 2015, sleep deprivation among American college students was up 57% over what it was in 1991. Okay? Quick example, the student I had, I'm not going to name her name, it was several years ago. She admitted this to me in class. We weren't, I wasn't inquiring about her personal life. She just kind of brought this out as an anecdote. When we were talking about cell phone use, she told me that her habit was, when she went to bed at night, she would put her cell phone, which was on her chest. She slept on her back. She would sleep on her back and put her cell phone on her chest. My first question was, why? She said, well, you never know who might need you in the middle of the night, if I have friends out, blah, 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 parents, whatever. I said, at 3 in the morning? She said, well, sometimes. And we went back and forth about this a little bit, and I had to ask her if she'd ever heard of the notion of REM sleep, right? The kind of sleep that you need just to restore your basic physical functioning. Right? She said, yeah. I said, do you think you're getting all of that you need? She said, I don't know. I don't know if this is still what she does these years later, but this is not a good sign, folks. Again, one example could be the extreme example. She could be the only person in the world who does this. I don't know. But if anybody's doing it, it's a little bit concerning, right? If anybody's doing it. Okay, so issue number 1, it can harm your physical health. Issue number 2, this is, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this either. This is all over the news, right? It absolutely seems to be the case that smartphones and social media overuse especially can harm your mental and emotional health, right? Here's some facts. Note the dates on this. February 23, 2021, right? This is new data. It's still coming in. There's a couple things I want to highlight here. Again, can't read all of this, right? But the whole notion that in fact, look at this, the second point there. From a 2021 report, this is from the Centers of Disease Control, found that 57% of females reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness during the past year, compared to 29% males. And that a staggering, that's my word, not the report, staggering 30% of teenage girls seriously considered suicide. It's almost 1 out of 3. Right? Something to think about. And if you read the New York Times, there's an article in the New York Times about the incidence of hospitalizations over self-harm just in tonight's paper. I encourage you to read it. It's not really directly about cell phone and social media, but it's just about how this is becoming a cultural problem. Okay? One other thing I want to highlight, this is the other quote in bold here. This is from some of the reading and research I've done. What's interesting about this is that one sociologist concluded that, in fact, when it comes to cell phones, and especially social media, there are no exceptions. All screen activities are linked to less happiness, and all non-screen activities are linked to more happiness. That's a bold claim. But what if it's true? Okay? No exceptions. Okay? Also note that this is also key to what the same scholars or same researchers are calling the 2-hour rule. For whatever reason, it seems to be that when you get past 2 hours of cell phone and social media use per day, mental health and sleep quality markedly declines. That seems to be the cutoff. Okay? Just for your consideration. Just for your consideration again. Okay? This is we can spend probably the rest of my talk talking about this last line here, this notion of fear of missing out, the whole notion of likes anxiety, right, that I've already called attention to, affirmation addiction, self-censoring, fear of being canceled, etc. These are all real mental health issues, right, in terms of the percentage. 2018, 54% of college students admitting to being afraid to share their opinions online. Or 2022, 80% confessed to self-censoring before they posted something online. That is thinking through, right? Trying to word what they say in such a way that they won't get significant blowback. Right? That's a lot of stress if you have to self-censor everything that you put online. Okay? And of course, back to FOMO, right? There's a real irony. Right? You guys know the fear of missing out, right? This whole notion that's been around, it's already been around probably for a decade. But I find that there's a real irony about fear of missing out in that, right? With this notion that if this is a genuine fear that is using or that is causing you to be driven back to social media, to make sure you know what everybody's doing, the very fact of being driven back to social media, notice how many times that when you're with somebody in a social situation, your phone is there too. So you're distracted. Right? So there's a really interesting link between this notion of being afraid of missing out, that when you actually get to the activity that you were afraid you were going to miss out on, that you're not actually there fully because you're distracted while you're there. So you actually end up missing out, like you fulfill this little fear of missing out, even though you actually went to the thing you were afraid of missing out on. Right? That's kind of interesting as well. All right. Need to keep going. All right. Number 3. Overuse of smartphones and social media may reduce your productivity. Right? A real irony here. I'm just, by the way, a little footnote. I am struck over and over how much of this data points in what I can only call an ironic direction. There's a real irony here, right? That those who sell us our smartphones, focus. Watch the ads. This has been a feature of the ads for 15 years. They focus on convenience and efficiency. But is that the whole story? Is that really how it works? Right? Is that really how it works? Really quick, somebody answer this question for me. How many hours per day, in your assessment, does the average Villanova student spend on her or his smartphone? 2? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say 6.
6, okay. You feel like, let's go back to my question. You think you're lowballing that, or you think that's about...
I've heard like from 4 to 8.
4 to 8. So you went with the average, 6. Anybody dispute that, or want to go give off for a different number? 6 hours a day.
It depends on if it's social media or,
I understand.
Or actually writing a paper.
On your smartphone? Okay. All right. Maybe. You might be doing research. You might be doing research on your smartphone. I don't know. But okay, we're going to leave it at 6 because that's, without getting too far into the details. The point of this is to kind of get us down to my last point, which is let's do some math, right? But these are some other statistics that are for your consideration. The average American viewer, so this includes people who are over 80, right, who have smartphones. It's not just teenagers. The average American viewer watches TikTok for 80 minutes a day. I don't know how much research you can do watching TikTok, but... Okay, right? So this goes to your point, Hector. So we're already at 80 minutes a day just for the average person, just with the one app. Okay? And of course, you all don't use just the one app, right? You use a lot of different things, all of which take at least some of your time. Okay? 2/3 of American teens use TikTok. Right? 1 in 6 report watching almost constantly. I don't know what that means. I don't even know what that could mean. Right? But it's an issue. That's according to Pew Research. Okay? Now let's do some math. This is really, I'm going to try to go through this quick. I'm not going to put the numbers up here, but I think it's pretty interesting, or at least worth consideration. Let's do a little bit of math. A white female born in the U.S. in 2003 has a life expectancy of 86 years. Okay? This means that you, if you're 20 years old in this room and you're female and white, you have about 66 years left. Okay? A year contains right about 8,766 hours. Thus, if you live another 66 years, you have about 578,556 hours left. Sounds like a lot, right? You're like, wow, that's a bunch of hours. That's cool. Okay, but wait. Let's say that you sleep an average of 6 hours out of every 24. That's probably not true, but okay, we're going to give you 6. That's 144,639 hours. This means that you have about 433,917 waking hours left. That's your life. Okay? Well, let's be conservative. I'm already going off your number. Let's be conservative and estimate that you will spend 4 hours each day using your smartphone or social media, and that this number will remain constant. That's going to be your average for the next 66 years. This means that from this point forward, you will spend approximately 96,426 hours on your phone. And that works out to 22.22% of your life. If this turns out to be true, how many of those 100,000 hours are you probably going to regret? Right? Especially when you get old like me, or say nothing of Dr. Graham, right? You really start to think about how you're using your time. Okay? All right, so that's productivity. Number 4, overuse of smartphones and social media may hinder your education and harm your intellectual life. This is another irony, I think, because we think that smartphones and social media are making us smarter. But is that the case, right? I'm just going to give you some examples here. So, interesting quote by a man named Max Fisher, author of The Chaos Machine. Social media algorithms are designed to change how we think, reflecting our minor prejudice back at us until we fall in love with those biases. Which, if he's correct, of course, right, actually indicates that social media might be making us less open-minded and more narrowly minded, right? Which I don't know if that's your goal when you came to college. You wanted to leave college more narrow-minded than when you got here? I hope not, right? But if he's correct, that's a bad sign. There's also this notion of when we own a cell phone, or when we use a cell phone a lot, when we rely upon the cell phone, there's a distinction between owning skills and renting skills. Not my language. This is some comments by sociologists, right? But the notion is that with our smartphones in our pocket and with all the things they can do for us, as we become reliant upon them, what we do is we tend to use them for things that we otherwise had to do old school, right? So that is to say, you say, oh, well, for example, I don't need to remember this. I'll just take a picture, right? Or I'll type it in the notes on my phone, or whatever you guys do. I don't even know. But the whole notion of memorization, right? But the problem is, that's not how memory works, right? Your memory, in order to actually be lodged in your brain, and for your brain when you sleep to actually restore the synapses that actually generate a memory, requires context and narrative. Photos in Google just won't cut it, okay? Also point out here, this is one of the quick spiritual reflections. If you look at the great traditions, and I'm talking particularly about Christianity, right? You can't be a spiritual person without a good memory. Right? It's at the center. Prayer, meditation, right? Thinking back about what's happened in your life, thinking about what God has done here, there, or yonder, right? It's a central feature of what practitioners of Christianity, for example, say constitutes the spiritual life, right? If your memory is bad, it's going to be really hard to be a profound spiritual person, right? Okay, just one example, right? Reading in general. Who coined the whole notion of too long didn't read? It wasn't my generation. Although, I'm not saying nobody in my generation ever skipped an assignment. Not the point. But it's common enough in your generation that you guys actually have a phrase for it. I'm not going to read that. That's going to take too much time. That's going to be too hard. Okay? Right? But the fact of the matter is, reading is still essential. Some of the most important arguments that you need to know about as an educated person require, they're complex. They require nuance. You have to actually read. You have to understand. You have to go figure out how the argument actually works. There aren't a lot of shortcuts. Right? So reading. Right? And then I'm going to skip over a couple of these, but the big idea here is that skills are like muscles. Time, effort, and focus are all required for them to expand. And if you get over-reliant on your smartphone or over-reliant on what it can do for you, right? You don't ever give yourself the chance to actually develop the skills, right? And it's also true that if you don't, think about it, right? Some skills at least have inherent value, right? When you actually take the time to master something, you develop confidence, you get a sense of accomplishment, right? You expand your independence, et cetera, right? But the whole notion here, the whole idea here is that maybe this was kind of a gradual thing. We didn't really intend it to happen, but we've fallen into the trap of becoming so reliant on our phones, right? That we've diminished both our interest and our capacity to develop skills that might make us better people. Certainly maybe more spiritual people. All right. I'm going to keep going. Number 5. This is another great irony, right? Overuse of smartphones and social media may actually hinder your social life. Well, how could that be, right? The irony is the fact that labeling social media doesn't guarantee better or deeper relationships. I don't think I even need to try to make that point, right? You guys probably know this is true already, right? That just because it has this name doesn't make it true, right? What's really interesting here is this phenomenon of loneliness, right? Which seems to be something, according to sociologists and psychologists, that marks the so-called I generation, iGen, right? They're born between 1995 and 2012. Despite the fact that you have more leisure time, this generation is the most isolated and lonely generation in U.S. history. While loneliness is often associated with aging, that is, we tend to think that it's older people who live by themselves who are the loneliest, the worst affected are, in fact, young Americans between 18 and 22. Okay? This is despite the fact that, as a general rule, again, according to sociologists, not my research, that this generation works less, they're physically alone more, this generation dates less, it sleeps less, and is less likely to get married. Okay? Loneliness is associated with many physical problems. One 2010 study found that being lonely has the same effect on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So maybe you guys aren't smoking, but you might still be cutting your life short in other ways. Okay? The whole notion that cell phones might actually, ironically, hinder your social life. Number 6. Right? And this is probably the most directly spiritual category of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, is this notion of overuse of smartphones and social media may render you less virtuous. Right? Most people, I think it's fair to say, when they talk about spirituality, they talk about spiritual practice both in terms of as being a good in and of itself, but also being good in terms of what it does for you, how it changes you, right? That's fair enough. Often this discussion is had in terms of virtue, right? Acquiring virtues, right? Becoming a better person, etc. I just give you 3 here, right, for your consideration. We could go into a whole lot more, right? But the notion of kindness, right? I thought this statistic is fascinating. Between 1980 and 2010, Americans demonstrated a 40% decline in empathy, with the majority occurring between 2000 and 2010. Patience, right? I don't think I need to argue this, right? But how dependence on smartphones oftentimes actually has ramped up our expectations in terms of the speed at which something should happen, right? So expectations, like the ones we typically have, don't often lead to cultivating patience. And then what about self-control, right? This, of course, is relevant to many aspects of our lives, but just to consider one, right? The notion of sexual self-control, which again, right, is a standard sort of approach to most of the great religious and spiritual traditions, right? Self-control, right? Think about what we are doing in terms of sexual self-control with our smartphones and social media, right? Everybody knows about dating and hookup apps, and everybody certainly is probably aware of digital porn, right? I gave a quote here. Virtual sex, again, this is referring to the status of American culture today. Virtual sex has become the opiate of the frustrated masses, right? With apologies to Karl Marx, right? Okay, a couple other facts here that you think you might find interesting. 40 million U.S. adults regularly visit porn websites. 40 million. At least, and this is self-reported, by the way. It's the people that are willing to admit to it, right? 10% of U.S. adults admit to having an addiction to internet porn. which works out to about 34 million people. Well, that's less than that if you take away the kids, right? I don't know exactly what the number is, but it's higher than 34 million. and again, the whole idea here, if this is the percentage of the folks who are willing to admit it, what must the actual number be? Okay? Research also shows that about 67% of 13-year-old boys have seen at least one pornographic image on some sort of digital device within the last year. 67%, 13 years old. Right? And by the age of 18, that number rises to 90%. And these statistics, I think, are worth pondering. Good question. What are either the long-term or, for that matter, the short-term consequences for a culture that would seem to prefer or at least equate porn and sex by oneself with other more traditional models such as dating, commitment, marriage? I don't think we know yet. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? But it's absolutely saturated our culture, no doubt about it. And I don't think anybody can deny that having a computer that's in your pocket that's connected that can grant this with a couple of keystrokes is at least partially to blame. Okay? So kindness, patience, self-control. All of these, I think, can seem to be in decline. So by way of summary, right? Now what? Summary is on the left-hand side of the slide. It seems that smartphones and social media are making us physically worse off, mentally worse off, emotionally worse off, less productive, stupider, lonelier, and less virtuous. Okay? As a culture. Okay? So then the question becomes, I'm not just going to leave you hanging right down in the pit, right, or the pit of hell. I'm going to actually try to give you some encouragement toward the end of my talk here. So can we escape this hell we seem to be building for ourselves? Right? With all due respect to Dante and his line about abandon all hope, ye who enter here, right? And to paraphrase President Obama, yes, I think we can, right? So what follows are 6 other strategies, and these will go much quicker than the problems. 6 strategies for escaping this world that we seem to be building for ourselves. I'll also argue that, like the previous list, these 6 will all impact our spiritual life, or your spiritual life, right? Point number 1, kind of a general remark, is that I think at the end of the day, it's fair to say that what we're experiencing as a culture is nothing new. That is to say, at least in the broad terms, right? That would-be spiritual people have been struggling against threats very similar to this one for centuries. As a historian, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that the past, and here I'm talking about specifically the Christian edition, definitely has tools in its toolkit, so to speak, that can help. While it is true that no previous generation has ever had to deal with smartphones and all of the good and bad that they make possible, it is also true that earlier generations did develop some principles that you can apply if your goal is to be both spiritual and have and use a smartphone in a controlled and thoughtful sort of way. Okay? So these include 6 strategies, right? Strategy number 1, practice honesty with yourself and with others. Objectively review your smartphone and social media activity. Discuss your findings with someone you trust. Chances are someone you trust will also have some comments about your smartphone use and your social media activity, right? They'll be able to maybe give you some insight. Be specific. My biggest struggle with my phone is, right, as a function of being honest, ask yourself hard questions. Consider the causes. What needs am I trying to meet? That is, why do I do what I do? Assuming there is an impetus behind it. What needs that I'm actually trying to meet as I use my smartphone, as I use social media as much as I do? Maybe do I need professional help? And to make a spiritual point, is this something you actually pray about? If you pray. Worth thinking about. Strategy number 2, practice intentionality, right? That is to say, of course, it's a much broader concept than what I'm giving it here. But basically, are you willing, right, if necessary, to cut some ties, either with friends or with certain social groups, right? What if it comes down to that? What if it's actually some of the people you're running around with are actually contributing to the problem or making it worse? If necessary, and this is kind of a big one, are you willing to be seen as different? Are you willing to be seen in your social circle as somebody who, doesn't use their cell phone as much, is not using social media, or is using it a lot less, or is only using certain apps? Whatever the case may be. But are you willing? Right? Are you willing to stand out a little bit? Because it might come down to that. Strategy number 3. Practice mindfulness and learn to be in the moment. Obviously, basic questions here. What is best for me today, this evening, for the next hour? Right? That's pretty basic stuff, but what I want to argue is, again, observing how people use their smartphones and social media, they often don't ask questions. It is habitual. It's unreflective. They pull their phone out at the drop of a hat. If you don't believe me, go to some public space where you might have to wait, pharmacy, wherever, and watch how quickly people get in their pocket, pull their phone out. Right? Can you hold on just 1 second? By the time the word second comes out, they've got the phone out. Right? Because it's unreflective. It's automatic. Right? What about when you're with others that you care about? Ask yourself the question: what does he or she need from me? What's my role here? Right? Is it about me or is it about them? Okay? And then finally, think beyond your smartphone. What do I mean by that, right? Is that this is, again, very basic, but don't allow your phone to dictate to you. Right? Keep in mind, you own the phone. Right? It's supposed to serve you, not vice versa. Right? And realize, of course, this may be obvious, that every time you get an alert, it's not necessarily DEFCON 1. Right? You might be able just to let it go. This one time. Right? That may be something you can think about. Every alert is not DEFCON 1. So practice mindfulness and be in the moment. Number 4. Give it consideration. Seek out both like-minded new friends and better role models. Right? This is a big step, right? But I want to point out this. This is in light of some of the statistics I've shared. I would argue that there are more tired of social media and lonely because of social media people out there than you think. Which is to say, if this is a concern for you and this is something you're thinking about, there probably are other people out there thinking the same thing. And it's just a matter of being honest and asking questions. Are you as tired as I am? Whatever. Okay? And I would also argue that many already know that they want something different. And then even another group already know that they need some help. Right? I think there are a lot of people out there, this is kind of, so far, largely undiscussed in our culture, right? But don't make the fatal mistake of relying on professional influence and other addicts to help you out of this, right? It's probably not a good resource. But I also want to bring to your mind that this is, I think, it's not just me, some middle-aged, old professor who's making this claim. If you actually look at what's out there, what people are saying about their cell phone and smartphone and social media use, right? There are a lot of examples of people who are already taking steps. Right? I've given you 3 here. This last one, you probably never heard of her, Emma Lemke, I think. She's actually, as a college student, founded the Log Off movement. You can go online, find her, read about her story, but she did this largely from a perspective of having realized what harm this was doing to her mental and emotional health. Right? And she started an entire movement among college students to get them to rethink their cell phone usage, right? Okay? The point here is that, of course, there are some people, even some people of your own generation, who are already taking action. And I think if enough of them do, you might actually see this whole idea of getting a little control of this as becoming a little bit cool, right? Again, it's not just some old middle-aged guy telling you this is bad, right? This is at least possible. All right? Number 5. Here we're getting a little more spiritual. Practice some accountability. If this is something you struggle with. Accountability, what do I mean by that? Definition, allowing another to hold us responsible for our actions in areas of our lives in which we struggle. Right? This gets back to finding somebody with whom you can be honest and who sees this as big a problem as you do. Right? Just bringing somebody in and saying, hey, I know the last 6 weeks I've spent 1 million hours on TikTok. Can you help me? Can you ask me questions today about how often was I doing this or doing that. Just somebody to help you maintain a little bit of accountability. This obviously requires someone who's already a good friend. And I will also point out that true accountability requires vulnerability, time, energy, and commitment from both parties. Okay? This is not easy, right? But this is also an ancient practice that I've already alluded to. So practicing accountability. Number 6, set and pursue some new goals. This, of course, this is going to be highly personal, but these are just some examples that I come up with, right? That I've come up with. Number 1, only submit to what is good and good for you. Again, asking hard questions. Do I really need that? Is this app actually a net good in my life? Right? But those are the only things you ought to submit to. Right? Things that are even questionable, probably not good things to submit to. Number 2, choose unitasking over multitasking. Right? I don't need to think to point out that multitasking is an illusion. Right? Any number of sociological studies have pointed this out. It's a word we use, and it's the way a lot of people live, but it's not something you can actually do. There's always sacrifices involved when you try to do more than one thing at a time. So choose unitasking. Just focus. Do one thing at a time. Reassess, another spiritual practice. Reassess your idea of solitude. Right? This is from another sociological study. We, meaning our society, turn time alone into a problem to be solved. Right? And I think I mistyped that. But we turn time alone into a problem to be solved. Right? Instead of having this idea that maybe some solitude is good for you. And not just solitude from other people, but solitude from your phone. Right? I would also argue that you could set a goal of building up your tolerance for time without your smartphone. Right? Meaning, what I'm trying to say there is that, okay, this is going to take a little planning, it's going to take a little foresight, but it's more than possible, right, to say today, Sunday afternoon, whatever, a day when you don't have a whole lot going on, you're going to turn your phone off and you're going to leave it off for 30 minutes. Just to see how that works, right? I realize that, you're thinking, okay, what if my mom calls? Well, text your mom and say, my phone's going to be off for 30 minutes, I'll text you when I come back on. Whatever. Plan ahead, right? But build up your tolerance for time without your smartphone